My name is Robert Chmielewski. I'm one of the organizers of this TEDx Beacon Street event held at WGBH today, November 23rd, 2019. I have the pleasure of interviewing Don Eyles, who was one of the amazing people who helped us put people on the moon back in the Apollo program. Don just finished his talk, and we're going to be asking a few additional questions and letting him elaborate on a few points that he made in his talk, which you will be able to see as soon as we stream it online at our website and WGBH's website. In your talk, you had talked about the connection that you formed with the astronauts, and that seemed to be one of the more rewarding aspects of the work that you had done. Can you tell the audience what were some of the most significant qualities that made an astronaut that you admired in them?
Well, the astronauts were stars to us, just as they were to the general public. They came with sort of a built-in charisma. I remember that for us youngsters, before we started to meet the astronauts, we would joke about it. We would joke about idiot-proofing our program, so that these dumb military guys could operate it. But that impression did not survive meeting them. Once we started meeting them, we realized that they were super intelligent guys, and that plus the charisma of being jet pilots and in most cases having flown spectacular earlier missions, they gave them a lot of credibility with us. And they were, I suppose it's a selection effect, because the ones I worked with obviously were open to our opinions, but many of them were, and the ones I talked about really did desire to understand the technology we were providing for them, partly because their own survival might depend on that, but partly because they were intelligent enough to understand it and really very interested in it. Of course, they were generalists. An astronaut has to be a generalist. He has to know a bit about a great many things. So they're not necessarily that dependable when in their memoirs they're describing technical things. Mm-hmm. And the fact that most of the astronaut books are written with the assistance of another writer who is not necessarily motivated to check the astronauts' stories means that those volumes are not necessarily so reliable.
How much of your attraction to them was the raw charisma that they had? Because it almost sounds like they were rock stars of their era.
They were rock stars, at least to us, but our relationship was based on the technology. It was based on the things we could do for them, which they understood that we could do for them. They, above all, wanted their mission to be a success, and we were the ones who could demonstrably help them do that.
Do you think a coder today has the same access to work with astronauts?
I don't think so, not within the government system. It's possible that in one of the leaner, meaner organizations, the SpaceX or the Bezos organization, that the same sort of interactions could occur. But I'm skeptical that they would occur, within NASA these days.
You mentioned these private space efforts. I want to go back to another thing that you had talked about, which was one of the things that really motivated you to put in the long hours and take the low salary and all the other sacrifices you had to make this effort work. It was that sense of adventure. And I think you said it by saying that we valued the adventure more than we valued our safety. And is that adventure still in the government space program? And if it isn't, where's it gone?
Has it gone anywhere? I think if it has gone anywhere, it's gone to the private companies that are in space. It's a feeling I would like to see return to the culture as a whole. But my impression, as an older fogey perhaps, is that people are much too focused on their next paycheck. They're much too focused when they're in school on the job they may be able to get. Whereas in my era, it was perfectly normal to have no idea what you were going to do until you graduated. And I think perhaps we've lost something that way. I went to a liberal arts college. to get the sort of job I got. These days you would probably want to go to an engineering school, but I think I'm better for having the liberal arts education.
When you were working on the Apollo program, it seemed from how you were describing it that the government just gave you folks, gave MIT a load of funding and outlined a vision that they wanted to get men on the moon within the decade, and you guys need to figure out how to get that done. And in fact, the gentleman who hired you, who you're working with, said, we not only have to figure out how to run a lunar module, but we have to figure out how to land it and get it back off, and we'll be the first ones to do it, but we're going to figure it out. Do you get the sense that people have that kind of freedom today when they get government contracts to do things?
No, I don't think so. And I think even in the days of the Apollo project, we were a special case because flight software then was a brand new field. And I don't think the government had evolved. I don't think NASA had the mechanisms really to look too deeply into what we were doing. And I think they even had some frustration about it, that they found us a little bit unmanageable in the sense that what we were doing was a little bit opaque, and they had some trouble seeing into it. There's a story told, which was part of the folklore of the instrumentation laboratory, of a meeting our founder, Doc Draper, had with Jim Webb, the head of NASA, also Jerry Wiesner and Bob Siemens in 1961, where Jim Webb says to Doc Draper, can you provide a guidance system that will take men safely to the moon and back? And Doc Draper says yes. Jim Webb asks, well, when will it be ready? Doc Draper says, it'll be ready when you need it, Mr. Webb. And Jim Webb says, well, how do I know it'll work? And Doc Draper said, well, I'll go along and operate it. And of course, and he followed up with a letter urging his qualifications as an astronaut. And of course, that was absurd. He was in his 60s and wore eyeglasses and had scrubbed out of flight school in his youth. But it does illustrate the sort of way procurement happened in those days. That conversation happened on a nice oriental carpet in front of a fireplace in Jim Webb's Georgetown mansion.
Well,
we don't do it that way anymore.
But let me ask the question: Did the product, meaning the successful guidance system, did that result efficiently and cost effectively because you had that freedom, because of the opacity?
I think that's very true. The fact that somebody at my level didn't have to worry about money, didn't even have to think about money. And
didn't have to get approved every step of the way.
Precisely. And I wouldn't have known who to go for approval to half the time because it wasn't even that clear exactly who I was working for. You know, the laboratory had org charts. I didn't know it at the time because they hid them. They literally hid them. Probably they were hiding them both from people like me at the lower levels, but also hiding them from Doc Draper, who didn't really believe in that sort of thing. But looking at those charts, I later figured out that I actually reported through 3 different chains of command. Of course, the whole term chain of command was foreign to us.
Well, we called that, in a company I worked at, we called that matrix management.
It was a little bit like matrix management.
You had several bosses, and they were all pulling you in different ways.
Whereas we had no bosses, and but we were being asked to do things, and we were cooperating with them.
So, just going back again to the opacity and the efficiencies that you were able to achieve, is that what we see happening in this shift from government to private sector? That private sector is sort of doing what, or allowing to happen, what you were able to do in the Apollo program?
Well, I don't have any particular insights into the middle of Musk's organization or Bezos's organization, so I can only say that I suspect that's the case from the amount of progress that they've been able to make, especially the amount that Elon Musk has shown us, that they must be running a pretty lean and mean sort of an organization, and how it actually relates to what we had in the 60s, I can't necessarily I'm not qualified to say.
All right. But you suspect that that's the case.
I suspect that that's the case.
Because you heard Leonard Kleinrock talk about how he had not too long ago gotten a contract from the government, and it was $50,000, and they wanted to watch him every step of the way. And that was something that was very difficult for him to deal with coming out of the ARPA era, which is very similar to what you experienced.
Well, I can certainly understand that. A decision that Alan Klump and I could make in a few hours in an afternoon would probably take months in a committee to do now.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for talking today.
My pleasure.
Folks, you will see Don Eyles' talk being posted on the TEDx beaconstreet.com website and also WGBH and on YouTube. Watch it and enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I know you were involved with Apollo 14, and there was a moment of, you were wondering, like, is it all going to work out? And you were put in a role where you helped solve something. Can you talk about that?
The problem had to do with a contaminated switch in the cockpit of the LEM. Stories have been told that I was at home asleep. That was not true at all. I was in my office at the lab, but a guy came and said to me, the abort discrete has appeared. What that meant was the signal from the abort button on the cockpit wall was reaching the computer. And at that point, it didn't matter because we were several hours away from lighting the engine. But if that erroneous signal had occurred during the lunar landing, it would have immediately boosted the spacecraft back up into orbit, and it would have been impossible to recycle and actually do the landing. Mm-hmm. So the question was how to make the software insensitive, not sensitive to that switch. Mm-hmm. And since it was my code that monitored the switch, it was natural that I was the one who needed to figure out how to defeat my own code.
Yep.
And the way I did that was to figure out, after looking at the code, that the only way to completely disable the monitor was to tell it that an abort was already in progress. Mm-hmm. So that was the first step of the procedure, was to set an indication that an abort was already occurring. And because of the way the software was managing the period that led up to lighting the engine, that did not derail that process, fortunately. So that was the key to the solution, and the other steps to the procedure were basically cleaning up afterwards.
So what precedent do you think that set for future programmers, for future software that we depend on? I'm just curious, is that a milestone in programming history, and what did you learn from that? Because I feel like there were some things that you guys didn't necessarily anticipate that you had to be ready for.
Mm-hmm. I think in a way it did sort of set a precedent for the guy, who maybe looks a little bit counterculture, who comes out of the woodwork to solve some problem. In the movie The Martian, that type of character appeared again. It did make a big impression on people, compared to all the hours I put in making the lunar landing code work. This seems like just a mere bagatelle, a 2-hour problem. Mm-hmm. A 15-minute problem we wouldn't have been able to help from Cambridge. Yep. So this was just the right size of a problem for us to handle the way we did.
Yep. So Apollo 11, that's the first one that landed on the moon with Armstrong. So as it was landing, I feel like I've read somewhere that you would have aborted, that there were too many variables. Maybe we talk a little bit about that and why would you have aborted? Did I get that right? And why didn't people listen to you if that's what you said? And if I got it wrong, no worries.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was one of those cases where things were happening too rapidly for us to have had any influence from Cambridge. Mm-hmm. And in this case, NASA in Houston had a better perspective than us. What happened was that during the powered descent on Apollo 11, we started getting alarms issued by the computer, 1201 and 1202 alarms. And what those meant was that the queues in the executive system were getting filled up so that it was not possible to schedule any more activity. And we knew at the time what happened when those alarms occurred. Mm-hmm. We did effectively a restart on the fly, a reboot on the fly, but we didn't know why. And that was tremendously concerning, that something was loose inside our computer that we did not understand. And in my position, that dominated my thoughts. And for safety's sake, I would have called an abort. But NASA had, in this case, a better perspective, because they had literally done a review of the so-called impossible alarms, and they knew that the spacecraft could keep flying with this alarm condition. And I think their perspective on it was better than ours. And so they did elect to continue, and as we know, the landing was successful.
So, two questions. I know, I know you're an artist, and I know in the 4-Point Channel, as you walk across that bridge that goes to the South Bay, there's a pyramid. Maybe talk a little bit about that. What does that reflect, and what was your thought behind that? And how did you get it out there, and why isn't it washed away? Talk about that.
Well, I mean, I liken it to my own private miniature space program, in the sense that there was a lot of logistics involved. There was a long period of procurement and construction. I mean, first design, then procurement, then construction, just as there would be for a space shot. And in fact, the launch, because we were launching into salt water, the tides are involved, which is an astronomical factor. But then once the piece is in the water, it has its career, it has its mission, and there's really no predicting exactly what will happen when it passes that point.
And were you commissioned? Did you sneak out there in the middle of the night and just set it up?
Well, that's a long story, because the first
combination,
the first of these pieces that were put in the water were cases where we sort of snuck out and did it. The most recent one, the one that you can see now from the Summer Street Bridge, as you cross from South Station into South Boston. That one was supported by a grant from the local arts organization.
So last question, 50th anniversary year, we see a lot of images of the astronauts in the space program. What do you think people aren't talking about that they should be? I think you addressed some of this in your talk, but from where you sat and your life experience, what do you want people to be aware of that may not be in the headlines or may be getting lost as we celebrate this milestone?
Well, some people paint the space program as something that we do instead of some of the things we need to do on Earth with respect to climate and other problems on Earth. I don't see it that way. I see the synergies between the space program and those things. So I would like to see a greater emphasis on space. I would like to see the funding for that come away from some of the less positive things that the government is doing in terms of the military and the procurement of weapons systems.
$1 trillion wars.
$1 trillion wars. As you say, the strategic weapons have already done damage because of the amount of creativity they've taken up that could have been spent on other purposes. Because a great deal of creativity
new
does
energy,
go.
New food,
Precisely.
New transportation, new housing, new longevity. I mean, think of all the things that we squandered. Our creativity. We didn't apply them to those things, I
agree with that. And the situation we had at the lab, where people might be working on a guided missile, a few offices down, I think that sort of situation tended to bring technology out of the military sector and into the civilian sector. And I think that was one of the side benefits of the space program.